Hello, my name is Sean from 3DIT, and today I'm going to be teaching you about microprocessors. I'm going to be discussing what exactly a microprocessor is, what it does, different types of microprocessors, the TDP of a microprocessor, and how to install a microprocessor. So you might be asking what exactly a microprocessor is. The microprocessor for a computer is also known as the Central Processing Unit, or CPU. The CPU is a chip in your computer that is responsible for interpreting and executing most of the commands from the computer's other hardware and software. There are different types of CPU which are categorized by manufacturer, socket type, clock speed, and number of cores in the CPU. When it comes to CPU, there are two manufacturers that are most popular for computers, AMD and Intel. There are also manufacturers for CPUs for your tablets and smartphones, but we'll be discussing them in a different video. This is an AMD chip. Modern AMD chips use pin grid array or PGA CPU packaging. PGA CPU sockets use metal pins to connect a CPU to a motherboard. The pins carry electrical signal to and from the CPU to the rest of the computer. This is an Intel chip. Modern Intel chips use land grid array or LGA CPU packaging. LGA is different than PGA in that the pins are already in the motherboard and that the LGA CPU sits in an enclosure on the motherboard and is secured using a pressure lever. The CPU rests in an enclosure through a series of grooves and communicates through the electronic signals transmitted through LANs surfaces inside the socket. Typically, there are three considerations when choosing a CPU: the clock speed of the CPU, the number of processing cores it has, and the flops rating. The clock speed of a CPU is the maximum number of clock cycles that a CPU can handle in a given period. Clock speed is basically the speed at which your CPU executes instructions. The higher the clock speed, faster the CPU. Clock speed is measured in hertz. For example, a 4 GHz CPU can perform up to 4 billion clock cycles per second. The speed at which a CPU performs a task is determined by the number of cores the CPU has. All modern CPUs have multiple cores which give you the ability to do multitasking. It splits up the workload between the cores, and if one gets clogged by a task, the CPU's overall work can still continue while you figure out what's wrong or eventually close the program to free up the core. A CPU with higher number of cores doesn't always mean that it's faster than a CPU with less cores. For example, video processing is something that can take advantage of having a lot of cores and split up the work individually or equally. Something like browsing the internet or playing video games really makes use of only one or two cores, so having a lot of cores won't be very helpful. It really all comes down to what you plan to do with your CPU. Finally, you need to understand what the flops rating of your CPU is. FLOPS stands for floating point operations per second. A floating point operation is any mathematical operation using floating point numbers. We measure CPUs with flops to truly see how fast the CPU really is. Well, clock speed might measure how fast the CPU is theoretically, but it isn't really measuring how fast the CPU is under load. Measuring a CPU with flops is one of the best ways we can actually compare CPUs. You will also need to keep in mind what the TDP or the thermal design power of your CPU is. TDP is used to measure the amount of heat a component is expected to output when under load. For example, a CPU might have a TDP of 90 watts and therefore is expected to output 90 watts worth of heat when in use. The higher the TDP, the more cooling that will be needed, whether it's fan-based or liquid cooling. It's also important to know that TDP does not equivalent to how much power the CPU will draw from the power supply, but it is a good indicator. Now that we've explained the basics of a CPU, I'm going to show you how to install one. When installing an AMD chip, you want to line up the chevron or the golden triangle with the one on the motherboard. I'm going to place the chip in. Any other orientation will not allow the chip to go into the socket. Press down the lever, it's secured, and you've just installed an AMD chip. When installing an Intel chip, line up the bottom left of the CPU with the bottom left of the socket. Place the chip in. It shouldn't be able to go into the socket with any other orientation. Make sure it's sitting nicely within the enclosure, and then press down the pressure lever. You may feel like you're going to break it, but you're not, so don't worry about that. And then once it's secured, you've just installed an Intel chip.